The Stone of Destiny sat under the English coronation chair for 700 years. But is it the real one? Or did heroic medieval Scots spirit away the real one to hide it from the evil Edward Longshanks? I'd always thought that was an impossible question to answer, until I read this book. So if you're interested in the people, places and events in Scottish history, then click the subscribe button at the bottom right of the screen and give a thumbs up at the end to let YouTube know if you enjoyed this video. In the meantime, let me tell you a story. As a Scottish tour guide, I live in the border where history and legend meet, which often brings me here, to Moot Hill in the grounds of Scone Palace, a place of pictish ceremonials even before it was the inauguration place of Scottish kings. If you know anything about Scotland's rocky relationship with our southern neighbours, you'll know that when Edward Longshanks invaded in 1296, he came here to steal our Stone of Destiny. If you know anything about Scottish conspiracy theories, then you'll know that the canny Scots duped the invading tyrant with an imitation. I was sceptical, but the book, The Mysterious Case of the Stone of Destiny, recently published by Tippermuir Books, has changed my view, and I'm going to give you 5 reasons why. The Stone of Destiny, the most iconic artefact in Scottish history. If you can think of a more important one, then let me know in the comment section. It came with Princess Scota from Egypt, travelled to Ireland and then crossed the Irish Sea before being brought to this place of reverence and ceremony by Kenneth MacAlpin, the first King of Scots. That's the legend. The point is that there's nothing that speaks more of Scottish existence and kingship, and that's why Edward wanted it. It's also why Scots would have wanted to stop him getting it. Did Scots spirit away the original? The book gives us a wonderfully detailed analysis of the case for and against. Now, I don't have time to go through the whole book. There are gems that I won't mention, and I don't want to spoil it for you either. Whilst it doesn't affect me financially, I want you to buy the book, and I'll leave a link top right and in the description below. But first, let me give you 5 points to think about. Let's look at the timeline. In October 1295, in spite of the risks from Edward's military power, Scots drafted an alliance with the French and then crossed the border and attacked Carlisle. 6 months later, Edward's army routed Scots near Dunbar on the 27th of April. Edward made a triumphal progress throughout Scotland, and on the 8th of August 1296, 4 months after the defeat at Dunbar, he stole the Stone of Destiny from here in the then Abbey of Scone, on which Scone Palace has been rebuilt. Now, they knew that Edward had stripped the Welsh of their national symbols. He had a thirst for that kind of stuff. There was no way that he was going to leave this Scottish one intact. Do you really think that the churchman, who would prove to be the backbone of Scottish resistance over the next 20 years, or nobility, whose canny guile would oppose Edward at every opportunity, or rank and file men who would lay down their lives with Wallace, would sit back for 4 months, knowing that Edward would come for Scotland's greatest symbol of sovereignty and independence? Okay, let's say that nobody in Scotland had the nerve or the gumption to protect the nation's most sacred object. Why is it that the stone that sits in Perth Museum today is so different from every ancient description. Our book gives various examples of the stone's likeness, from chronicles and royal seals, coronation rituals. And some might seem fanciful, or recorded with hindsight, or by people too distant from the events. But what about the description given by Walter of Guisborough? Guisborough being the Augustinian priory established on Bruce lands in Yorkshire as a religious centre and mausoleum for the Bruce family. When Walter wrote a contemporary account of the coronation of John Balliol here, in which the Bruce family took a very keen interest, did he get the description of the stone so wrong? Why do medieval descriptions refer to large, ornate, curved, full-sized chairs of marble stone? They were brought from exotic places like Egypt, Ireland, or at the very least, Argyll. And yet not one describes a rough-hewn oblong block of sandstone whose geological signature ties it to rock a stone's throw from here in Scone. But here's the thing that convinced me, and I hope that it will you. What were Edward's plans for the stone? First, Edward loved a holy relic. He loved the power that they implied, the meaning that they conveyed, and the benefits that they bestowed. Aside from trinkets taken from the Welsh, Edward had acquired 2 lumps of rock from Calvary, 2 pieces of the true cross, and a thorn from the crown of Christ. Now he had Jacob's pillow, brought with Scota, the daughter of an Egyptian pharaoh and possessed by the King of Scots, whom he undoubtedly now was. He would want a very special display for this relic. And in his book, David Moll describes an invoice that survives to this day sent to Edward by his goldsmith. The invoice was for the construction of that very special display, a bronze chair for putting on the stone on which the kings of Scotland were crowned. The bill itemises £5 for a wooden model of the throne, £12 5 shillings for £1,500 of copper and tin for the alloy, £10 to pay the worker who created the templates, moulds and castings, £9 7 shillings and 11 for payment to various workers after the castings, and £2 for tools and the repair of tools. £38 12 shillings and 11 spent on this not quite finished project was the equivalent of keeping almost 800 knights in the field for a day. That was a lot of money, even for the King of England. But what about the human prizes that Edward gained from his invasion of Scotland? Numerous knights and noblemen captured at the Battle of Dunbar were locked up in the Tower of London and other castle prisons around his kingdom. They were offered a deal. Instead of languishing in prison waiting for ransom, they could go and fight for Edward in Flanders. Many took up the offer. Did they see the ongoing work on this fancy bronze chair? Did they see the stone itself? They, like Bruce, were the very type of people who would have been at the enthronement of John Balliol here a few years before. Did some of them look at the stone and say to Edward, "Somebody's ripping a pish"? I don't know. What I do know is that on the 30th of July 1297, Scottish hostages were released on parole. Edward left Westminster and took them to fight the French, and work on the elaborate bronze chair stopped. Barely had Edward reached Flanders before William Wallace defeated an English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. 6 months later, Edward was on his way back to march a new army north to the Battle of Falkirk. Now here's the thing. After Edward's victory at Falkirk, he remained in Stirling for a few weeks. And the Abbey records at Scone tell us that in the month of August, the 17th day, in the time of Thomas, 11th Abbot of Scone, by the mercy of God, concerning the monastery of Scone, which has been destroyed by the efforts of the King of England, the wood carvings in the church, the refectory, the dormitory, the cloister, the treasury, consecrated hosts, the altar, chests, coffins and reliquaries have been battered and broken up, so that wherever in the monastery one looks, things are broken, even in its smithy, hall and baptistry. Now, unlike some atrocities committed at the time, nobody was killed, and the place wasn't burned to the ground. It was more like, you know, in a spy intrigue, where the baddies carry out a violent search, desperately looking for some vital item and trashing everything else as they went. What might they have been looking for? Why was retribution needed? Surely, Scone had already given up its most valuable possession to Edward the year before. Whatever they were looking for, Edward seems to have returned to Westminster empty-handed. The hugely expensive, ornate, almost finished bronze throne ordered from his goldsmith was cancelled and scrapped. A new chair was ordered for the King's painter, Walter of Durham. It's that wooden chair on which subsequent kings of England were crowned. It remains in Westminster Abbey to this day, with a slot underneath to store the sandstone block brought from Scone all those years ago. What convinces me that the stone was swapped isn't the description of the stone or the will of the Scots to hide it, but the behaviour of the English king once he had it. And here's one more point. In 1328, Edward III issued a writ ordering the stone to be sent back to Scotland, but was resisted by the Abbot of London. 1328, when peace was finally agreed between Robert the Bruce and the grandson of Edward Longshanks. Now it seems that Edward III was happy to send the stone back to Scotland. It was just some folks in London who objected. Why did nobody in Scotland make a big deal about it at the time? Before and after the Battle of Bannockburn, the English had been racked by division, and good Sir James Douglas ravaged England at will to exact tribute. Despite the strength of our negotiating position, the peace treaty doesn't demand the return of the stone. Edward's willing, and yet the Scots don't make a scene when some London abbot stands in their way. Other holy relics are returned. The Scots do ask for the English king's good offices with the Pope to get holy anointing oil for future coronations, but no mention of the stone, which had been the essential element of inauguration since time immemorial. Strange, wouldn't you say? Whether or not you think the stone in Perth Museum's the original, this is definitely its location. This is real. Now, does that mean that you should miss out on a visit to Perth Museum? Definitely not. A visit here to Scone Palace and to the sandstone block in Perth Museum are essential for anyone interested in Scotland and its past. I just travelled across Canada and visited museums and reconstructed forts to see things far younger and less significant in themselves than what you can go and see in Perth Museum today. Not least because David Moll in his book suggests what he thinks the stone from here actually is and why it's special in itself. Plus, it's still the 700-year-old stone that was taken to London, symbolised our nationhood, repatriated in the 1950s, and on which now British monarchs are crowned to this day. But if you're like me, another question must be in your mind. If the real stone was hidden, who hid it? David's worked out the likely culprits in his book. You should buy it just for that. Alternatively, if you'd like me to comment on that question, why not let me know in the comment section. If I get enough people asking, then I'll add that video to link through to. Until then, if you want to know the last time a coronation was held here, then I made a video about that. It's definitely one to watch. One or other of those videos is coming up on screen now. Support the channel by clicking top right to become a Patreon member or buy me a coffee in the description below. In the meantime, ha mi an dóchas gwn bí lá málaigh. Séirí an drasta.